If you've ever opened up Melodyne and been overwhelmed by the interface or all of the tools available for you inside of it, I'm going to demystify all of that for you in this Melodyne deep dive. Hey, it's Joseph Cheek here, and welcome back to our Melodyne series. In this video, I'm going to walk you through opening up Melodyne and just having a look at all the tools that are in there. When you open up for the first time, it can be a little bit intimidating. However, once you get the workflow down and you understand all the tools, it's a super powerful vocal tuning processor and can be really quick and easy to use. So my goal of this video is just to help you get up and running with it so you can get the absolute most out of Melodyne and out of your vocal performances. Let's get stuck into it. So first of all, when you're using Melodyne, you'll have to load it up as a plugin in your DAW. Now, if you're using a DAW that has ARA functionality, it makes it super quick and easy to load up Melodyne. All you have to do, for example, if you're using Pro Tools, is click down here, go to ARA plugin and select Melodyne. This will open it up and basically instantly analyze your vocal performance for you, which is great because the old way of doing it requires you to go through and basically record your vocal performance into Melodyne. So if you're not using a DAW that does have the ARA functionality, you will have to do that, and I'll show you how to do that now. So in the case of your DAW not having that functionality, you'll have to load Melodyne up into the first slot in your plugins. So select Melodyne, and then basically you have to hit this little record button or transfer up the top and record all your vocals into Melodyne. And this can only really be done in real time, so it's a little bit of a pain. And one thing to note is that after you do record your vocals into Melodyne, your vocals are then being played from Melodyne and not from the timeline in your DAW. So if we do record them in, and then we go and delete a chunk of this, for example, it won't actually affect what you're hearing back because the vocals are now playing back from Melodyne. And that's why we always want to have it as the first instance in our plugins, because all the processing will be applied to that. And if you are recording it into Melodyne when you've already got processing on, all that processing will be recorded into Melodyne as well. For example, if Melodyne was a third slot in your inserts and you had a compressor and an EQ or something like that before it, all of that data will be getting recorded into Melodyne. So it's always best to start with a clean slate and just the pure vocal, then process it after. So if you are using a DAW that doesn't have the ARA functionality, you will have to go through and record all your vocals into Melodyne before you can start tuning them. However, it's great that Pro Tools has this, so we can just simply open it up. And like I said, it almost instantly analyzes all of the data so you can start working on it basically immediately. So let's have a look. I'll just highlight a passage here and we'll get started. So when you first open it up, depending on which version of Melodyne you have, you may not have this sidebar here. So this is the top version of Melodyne, Melodyne Studio, where if you do have multiple instances of Melodyne on different tracks, you will be able to access them all from this sidebar and flip between them really quickly. However, if you're using any of the other versions, you won't have that little sidebar there to flick between them, which is completely fine. So first of all, we're going to start in the center here, because these are all your main controls. So first of all, we just have the standard pointer. You can highlight things, you can select things. So that's pretty easy to get your head around, and then you can just move them up and down. Now by default, Melodyne will move it exactly one semitone if you're just dragging this around on your main tool. However, if you hold Option or Alt on your Mac, you can drag it up any increment that you want to. And so that makes it really quick and easy just to fine tune things just by holding Option and then dragging. Now, one thing to note is that as you can probably hear, it sounds pretty weird when you click and hold a note. Basically, Melodyne just generates a tone based on their voice so that you can hear which note is actually playing. So it's not how the singer actually sounds, and it's not going to sound super robotic and weird like that. It's just giving you an indication of the note that they're singing so that you can best hear which note you're trying to aim for. Now, most of these tools up here have a little drop down. So you can see the arrow on 5 out of 6 of them. So if you hold that arrow, you'll see there are other tools below that. So the next one is the scroll tool. I don't really ever use this. This is just if you want to move around like that. But if you're using a Mac and you have a Magic Mouse, it's super easy just to scroll up or down or sideways using your Magic Mouse. If you're not on Mac and you don't have a Magic Mouse, I'm sure there are other ways that you can do it on Windows to easily scroll around as well without using this little scroll tool. The next one down though is one that you will use, which is the zoom tool. So this allows us to either zoom in on particular parts of the song that we want to look at in a bit finer detail, or we can zoom out. So basically how this works, if you click and drag to the left, it'll zoom out horizontally. If you click and drag to the right, it'll zoom in horizontally. If you click and drag down, it'll zoom in vertically. And if you click and drag up, it'll zoom out vertically. So you'll get the hang of that pretty quickly. And probably most of the time you'll find that you're kind of doing diagonal zooms like that. So it goes in and out both vertically and horizontally at the same time. So that's it for the first little tool here and the drop down. Now the next one is the pitch tool. And this in itself does the same thing as just when you're on the main tool here, where you can drag it up and down. So when you're on the pitch tool, you can also drag that up and down. And again, if you hold Option, you can fine tune it. So just dragging it up a little bit. And now one other thing to note is that most of these tools where you're actually affecting the pitch can snap to where it thinks is perfect if you just double click them. So if I double click on one of these notes, you'll see it moves up that tiny bit. If I just go undo and watch that again, you see it moves up just that little bit. So that's a quick way of just snapping it to what is the center of the note according to Melodyne. And while we're talking about the center of the note, you've probably noticed that there's a couple different displays that we're looking at. There's these little red blob looking things, and the technical name for them inside of Melodyne is in fact blobs. So if you ever hear Melodyne talking about blobs or hear people talking about Melodyne in respect to blobs, that's what they're talking about. And these just give us the average pitch of the note that you've highlighted. So if it's down here, for example, on this note, which is a little bit below the center of probably where it should be, this is just saying that that's the average that Melodyne has worked out of the note. So we can see it's probably a little bit flat and needs to be brought up. And if we double click, it should just pop up there. Now, one thing to note is the bigger the blob is, so the taller it is, that means the louder the performance was. And if it's skinny, like this little one down here, then that note was sung much softer than, say, this one up here, which is quite big. Now, if the blobs are too big, you can turn them down in the bottom right corner here by just dragging this down or up. So by default, it'll be up as far as it goes when you open Melodyne, showing the maximum magnification of the blob, but then you can drag it down. Now, sometimes I receive vocals that have been recorded elsewhere and they've recorded super, super loud and the blobs are just huge. So in that case, I basically always have to turn it down quite a lot, just so the whole screen isn't taken up by these blobs and it's really hard to tell where it's actually sitting relative to the note. And if you haven't noticed yet, you'll see that this is actually a piano roll. Just like when you're using MIDI, if you've used MIDI in your productions before, when you're editing MIDI or writing in MIDI, you're always doing it in the piano roll. And that's essentially what we're looking at in the background here. So if we look at the left here, we'll see the notes lining up with the piano roll. However, you might notice something a bit strange, which is that these notes along the side don't actually line up with the black and white notes on the piano. That's because Melodyne does this thing where if you set the key of the song, which you can do by basically clicking on any of these notes down the side and then selecting a scale, it essentially moves the piano roll up and down so that you're always trying to tune it to the white notes. Now, I don't really love that feature, but if you're new to music theory and you don't know exactly which scale has which sharps or flats, it can be really handy because that way you're always just tuning it to the white notes on here, 99% of the time. Of course, there can be notes that are intentionally not directly in the scale and they might end up being on a black note. But for most of the cases, if you're just doing basic pop or other genres where it doesn't get too out there melodically, then you'll just tune to the white note if you selected the correct key along the side here. Whereas if I do just select C major, this will show us the actual notes that line up with the piano roll. So now we can see the C along here is where a C would normally be on the piano. For now though, I'll just pop it back to G minor. And Melodyne will try and work out the key for you, and normally it's pretty good depending on the singer. If the singer's really nailed it, then Melodyne should get it right most of the time. However, if the singer is a little bit pitchy and they are singing some wrong notes, it may get a little bit confused and show you the wrong key. So you will have to double check that when you open up Melodyne that it actually has selected the correct key. If it hasn't, then just go along to the side here and select the correct key in this menu. Now, one other neat feature when you are on the pitch tool, like we're on at the moment, is that you can change the transition between the notes. So you can see if I'm hovering in the middle of the note, it's just showing the standard pitch tool. However, if I get towards the end of a note, you can see the little pitch tool icon changes. And what this allows us to do is change the transition between the notes. And I'll demonstrate that here. And to use this, we just click and drag either up or down. So that one's probably not the best example to start with, but let's have a look at this one, for example. Now, I actually haven't mentioned this yet, but this continuous line that you see over top of the blobs is the exact pitch that the singer is singing at every point in time. So the blob gives us the average pitch of the note, whereas this line over top gives us the exact pitch while it's running. So at every point in time, we can see exactly the pitch they were singing. So let's have a look here. If I select this note, you can see it kind of goes to another note in between and then up to the top note. So sometimes Melodyne won't automatically split it, but we'll get to that in a second. However, if I now use this little pitch transition tool and slide this up, you can see that instead of going a little bit sharp, then back to the note up here, it actually smooths it out. So it kind of just goes right onto the note. So see that going up and down there, and we can go back a little bit further than where it was to start with as well. So that can be really handy if the singer kind of does go a little bit sharp or a little bit flat as they transition, just to smooth that out. And with all of these tools in Melodyne, it's always best to listen to it. I know that sounds silly, but you'll be amazed how many people don't take the time to actually listen back to what they've done. So always listen back and make sure it sounds natural. The point of using Melodyne is to give a really natural and transparent tuning to your vocal performance. Okay, so now if we look at this pitch tool and click on the little drop-down icon, we'll see two more tools here. First of all is the pitch modulation tool, then the pitch drift tool. So let's have a look at the modulation tool first of all. Now what this one does is allows us to flatten out or increase things like vibrato. So we've got this continuous line, which is the exact tuning, like I said, at every point in time of the performance. And this allows us to see the vibrato at the end of notes. Now let me just scroll along and see if we can find any nice vibrato to look at. This one has a lot of short notes in the song, so probably not as much. You can see there's a little bit at the end of this note and a little bit at the end of this note. So what I'll do now is go back to the pitch tool and just double click here, and that should snap this long note up so the average is in the center of this note. Now I'm going to swap over to that pitch modulation tool. Now let's say we didn't like the vibrato. What we can do is click and drag down on this note to flatten out that performance. So essentially it just compresses down that vibrato, or if we want to make it more extreme, we can go the other way, where it goes really nuts at the end. Now, you want to use that lightly on things like vibrato. You don't ever want to go too nuts, but it can be a handy tool just to smooth things out a little bit where you need them to. Or if you're not looking at vibrato and you just want to smooth out a note that's held or a note that might be a little bit too jumpy, just say this one, for example. Obviously, we haven't heard it, but let's just say we thought it was a little bit too up and down. we can just smooth that out a little bit using the pitch modulation tool. So there you go, we've smoothed it out and just made that little bit more consistent. Now you might be able to see there's something funny happen to this continuous line here when I was using that. And that is one of the artifacts of using this pitch modulation tool, that instead of having nice smooth transitions between notes, they'll start to be square. And when they do start to become square, that's when they do start to sound more like auto-tune and less like transparent Melodyne tuning. Now, one way to help mitigate that is to go back to our pitch tool and use a little transition tool, and we can smooth that out a little bit. And if I go back to that, so you can see that line looks a little smoother now, and there aren't any really hard, sharp 90-degree turns in that vocal performance as far as the tuning goes. So that should help it to sound more transparent. But like I said, you always have to listen back just to make sure it does. But using a combination of that modulation tool and the transition tool can help to smooth out the performance in a really nice way and just get rid of any little bumps in there that you don't want. Now finally, let's have a look at the pitch drift tool. And this note here is probably a great example to use this on. So what the pitch drift does is just correct a note over time. So you can see this one probably starts a little bit flat. If we're thinking the center of the note would be just above this, maybe I'll zoom in. Let's zoom in like that. So if we imagine the center of the note is probably here, we can see it starts a little bit flat, then kind of goes a little bit sharp on the start of the vibrato, then probably kind of evens out almost in the center. So the pitch drift tool just helps us average that out over time. So just see what happens when I drag down on this note. Can you see how it's brought the start of that note up into the center of the note? So there's more in tune at the start instead of being a little bit flat at the start. And then also this next bit of vibrato has come down so that's not too sharp. However, it looks like it has made the end of the note a little bit flat now. So you do have to play around with this and try and dial it in as best as you can so that it sounds transparent and that you're getting the notes in tune as much as they can be. Now, sometimes if it does do a big kind of spike like this in Melodyne, where maybe she's gone up to this next note right at the end of the note, but Melodyne hasn't actually detected that as a separate note that she's sung. It's kind of saying that this note has this huge bit on the end that kind of spikes up. What we can do is go over to this final tool here. So I'm skipping over a few, but this one is called the note separation tool, which does exactly what you think it would do, separates notes. So let's select that. Now to use this, all we need to do is double click where we want to make a separation. And generally this is right on the transition between two notes. So if we want to separate this little high bit here from this rest of the note down the bottom, I would just click around here. And there we go, that'll zoom up and become its own little blob up here, and the rest of the blob will be down here. Now, one great thing about doing this is that it should help us get this whole note in tune with the pitch drift tool. So it's looking a little better than what it did before, where it kind of dipped off quite a bit at the end. But then we can go back to our pitch tool and use the transition tool just to bring that last little bit up. So once we've done that, this is looking pretty even to me now, where the whole note is pretty centered where it should be, instead of starting off flat, then going sharp, and then going flat again. So that's how we can use a combination of these tools to really look at a note in detail. And obviously, if you are just using an auto-tune plugin, you can't do any of this because the plugin just automatically goes through and tunes it and snaps it to the nearest note, as the name suggests. So this is why Melodyne is so powerful, because you can get in there into tiny detail and really tweak notes. Now, there is another tool under this called Separation Type Tool. However, we'll come back to that one in a second. It's not as essential to know as the standard separation tool. So let's go back to the fourth tool now. So again, skipping the former tool just for now. So let's have a look at the amplitude tool. So amplitude in audio just refers to how loud or soft something is. If it's got a greater amplitude, then it'll be louder. So if we select the amplitude tool, then go down to a note, if we drag up, it'll make it louder, and if we drag down, it'll make it softer. If we keep on dragging, it'll say off up here, and we know that we've gone all the way down as far as it can go, and it's not going to make any sound. If we drag up a little bit, you can see it's telling us how much we've changed the gain in that note. So at the moment, we've turned it down 36 dB, which is heaps. So for now, let's just bring it back to where it was to start with. So about there. Now, if we do double click, you can see that it mutes the note. The note just disappears altogether. So that could be if there's some little strange noise in there that you want to get rid of, then that's just a quick and easy way to do that. And again, if you double click, it'll bring it back for you. And now in this little window up the top, you can also just double click and type in the value you like as well. So say I didn't get it right back to 0, I can always just type that in here and it'll go straight back to 0 for me. Now there are a couple more tools underneath the amplitude tool as well. One is a fade tool where you can just apply fade ins and fade outs on notes. Now I've never really found a need for that inside of Melodyne. Normally any fades I do will just be on the timeline to the actual audio clip. And then there's this sibilant balance tool down the bottom. Now this is a quite clever little tool here. What it does is allow us to turn down sibilants, which is normally S sounds, but can also be other harsh sounding consonants. It allows us to turn them down separate to the actual tone and held notes. So the thing about consonants is that they're generally not pitched, which is a weird concept. So if you just say S, so S, it doesn't have a pitch to it. It's kind of just like white noise. And in Melodyne, we can really easily see those bits. So one, because the actual pitch line stops. So you can see the end of this note, there's no pitch line. This note, there's no pitch line. And the end of this note, there's no pitch line. And if I just zoom in here, we'll be able to see it in more detail. And you can see it's kind of colored in, whereas these ones aren't. So Melodyne gives us a lot of detail about what's actually going on here. So without listening to this, I could tell that this will be some kind of either unpitched consonant or potentially a breath. This one looks like it might be before a line. It could be a breath. This one's probably a consonant at the end of a line. Let's just play that. And if we just double click on the timeline, it should play it from where we click.
Hey, why don't you come on over?
There you go. So that's just kind of a breath there. Let's have a look at this one over here. Again, kind of a breath at the end. Probably not a great song for S's, which generally makes it a little bit easier in editing.
Ginger hair and the way you like to dress. So won't you come on over?
Okay, so there's a bit of an S down here, and again we can see that the pitch line stops, and then we've just got this little coloured in bit at the end of the blob.
So won't you come on over?
So what this sibilant balance tool does is allow us to turn up or down the amplitude of the sibilants separately to the amplitude of the rest of the blob. So it's quite clever. So if I drag this down, you can see the end of the note gets turned down, but the start doesn't. So that's a really nifty little feature. Then if we go all the way up, then it actually turns up the sibilants and down the main note. And that's why it's called the balance tool, because it's just balancing between the sibilants and the actual pitched part of the note. So normally you'd want to use that just to turn down the sibilants. You probably don't want to use it to turn up the sibilants and down the main note. So that can be really handy just to tweak sibilants if a de-esser isn't quite cutting it for you. Next, let's have a look at the timing tool. And we won't bother looking at these ones down here, because they're not as essential as just the general timing tool, at least for now when you're getting started. So as I said, we're looking at a piano roll in the background here. So we've got the notes going up and down the page, and then to the left and the right, we have the time in the song. So we can see we've got the bar numbers here, and then we've got the subdivisions between the bars. So at the moment, we're just seeing each beat. So beat 1 right on bar 63, beat 2, beat 3, beat 4. And then we've got bar 64 and beat 1 again. Now, I don't think this song was actually recorded with setting up the tempo inside the DAW because we were just recording to a backing track, so there wasn't really a need to, as it was just a quick demo. However, if this was recorded to a click, then these would line up with the bars in your song. And what we can do, we can change the subdivision if we want, just by going up to Options, then Time Grid, and then say if we want to see an eighth note instead of a quarter note, then we have twice as many subdivisions. Now, when we're in this mode, we can alter the timing. Now, you may have seen there was this little option here, Active. If that's ticked, then when we select these and drag them around, they're going to move by the subdivision that we've selected. So you can see we selected an eighth note, and this is moving it 1/8 note relative over to the left when I drag that. Now, if I hold Option, then I can do small drags, just like when we're on the pitch tool and we can drag it up and down by any small increment. So often you probably won't want to drag it by a whole subdivision. So you can either hold Option and then drag, or you can go up to Options again and just click this Active button to get rid of the tick. And now you don't have to hold Option and you can just move that as much as you want to. So that can be really handy if you just want to fine tweak some timing of vocal performances. So sometimes people might not enter right on the beat, they might be a little late or a little early. So Melodyne is actually also really transparent for timing adjustments, not just tuning adjustments. So keep that in mind as well as you're going through. Now, if you think you've messed anything up too much, you can always highlight everything you've done, then go up to Edit in the menu, then go Restore Original, and you can either restore just the pitch, just the performance, just the amplitude, just the time, or you can do everything if you want to. So for this one, let's just go Undo All Changes. And you can see there wasn't much to change there. It just snapped back slightly on the timing. But if we did have that up there and this down here and that there, and we change the transition tool as well, and maybe change the timing a little bit more. So it's pretty messed up. Then if we go up here, Edit, Restore Original, Undo All Changes, you can see that snaps back to where it was. So as long as you haven't committed this or bounced it down, you can always go back to the original state if you think you've gone too far with any of these tools. So then finally, we've got the formant. And if you haven't heard that term before, it basically refers to the timbre of the vocal performance, which is the kind of the overall tonality of it. So if you drag it up, kind of sounds like a chipmunk. And if you drag it down, it kind of makes it sound like you're singing a lot lower than you are, although the actual note itself doesn't change. So if I just select a bunch here, drag them down, and you can see the formant is changing separate to the actual notes, so the notes are staying where they are. That just kind of keeps on going. And if we play this, so you've probably heard that kind of sound before in songs. So that's the formant, adjusting the formant. So again, we probably want to undo that. You can just go Command Z and it will undo it. And if we go the other way, starts sounding real chipmunky and weird. So that's a fun little tool. Now it can be handy to use that if a singer has sung quite out of tune on some notes, and when you tune it to the correct note, it starts sounding a little bit strange. You can use the formant to actually correct that strange sound and make it sound like they did actually sing that to start with, where the tone sounds right for the note. However, I'm not going to get into more detail for that in this video. The main thing for now is just to know that that is the formant tool, and you can play around the formants there if you want to. So let me just reset all of these. Now, just for now, I'm just going to look at this macro tool here, which is the correct pitch macro. Now, if I select everything and then we go to the correct pitch macro, we have two sliders to choose from. We've got the pitch center and then the pitch drift. So that's the one where if a note starts flat and then goes sharp, it just evens that out. So you can see a little bit of action there. It's probably not the best passage that I've chosen to demonstrate that. Let's see if there's something better. Maybe back over here. So this is that original passage with that long note, I believe. If I just undo this for now. There we go. And I'll just zoom in here. And we can highlight everything. Go Command A, just highlights everything in your whole song. If you are going to do that, you want to make sure it was sung pretty well to start with, or you might mess some stuff up a lot with things just snapping to the wrong notes. You have to then go through and just change each one, make sure they're all correct. But if we do this to start with, pitch center, and then pitch drift, it can be a really quick and easy way to get things pretty much where you want them and then just fine tweak them from there. And you'll also see there's this button here, snap to chord scale. So that means if someone perhaps has sung too flat and Melodyne thinks that it's actually closer to the next note, which isn't in the scale, if you've selected this, it will know that you didn't actually want to go to that note, and it'll just go to the next note in the chord scale, so it'll go back up to where it was meant to be. And you can see a couple notes here did change when I selected that. And if I put the pitch center back, so this one here, for example, is slightly above the middle of these two notes. So if there's this line here between the two notes, it is slightly into the black one, whereas perhaps it was meant to be in the white one, because if we have the right key selected, then it should be white notes. So when we do this, it does go up to the wrong one, just because that's the closest note. However, if I select snap to chord scale, then it moves down to the next white note. So that can be a really handy way just to quickly get things pretty well in the right spot to start with, without going straight into the really fine tuning. And of course, you can just select a small passage at a time, go up here, and then just dial that in really quickly. And then you can go back in and do your fine tuning. And while I'm showing you this, you can see that as I'm doing the transition tool, if I've selected a bunch of notes, then it will change the transition of all of those notes into the subsequent notes. And that can also be handy, but also bad if you've selected ones you don't want to select, and some weird things can happen. So there are a few more tools in Melodyne, but I'm going to leave it at that for this video, because they're really the essential ones that you need to know in order to really fine tune your vocals and get into the nitty gritty of them. So I really hope this video was helpful for you. If you found it helpful, please like and subscribe so I can continue making these for you. And stay tuned, because later in the series, I'm going to give you some shortcuts in Melodyne that will drastically improve your workflow and speed up the process and take out heaps of mouse clicks for you. So stay tuned for that. Now go have some fun in Melodyne and play with all those different tools, and I'll see you in the next one.